The Cincinnati Bengals have a massive season ahead for them. With tons of really good players on this team and tons of expectations, the Cincinnati Bengals are primed for what should be a massive season. But in today's video, I want to personally talk about why I personally do believe in the Cincinnati Bengals, and I personally view them as a team that has a lot of momentum heading into 2024. So the way the video is going to work is I'm going to start off by talking about some of the really good positive things that are going for the Cincinnati Bengals teams, all the reasons why I think this team is going to have a really good 2024 season. Then after that, we're going to be talking about some more of like the negative things, some things I'm not really happy about with this current Cincinnati Bengals team. These are things that maybe they have some control over and some things that this team doesn't really have control over. And then at the very end, I'll give you guys my unofficial synopsis as to what I think the Cincinnati Bengals will do in 2024. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to start off with the positive things that are going for the Cincinnati Bengals. And we're just going to briefly talk about the overall roster before we get to any sort of big picture stuff for this team. And roster-wise, it's one of the better units in the NFL. There really is not a big-time hole in any single position. Like, yes, maybe there's some question marks about the receiving core, especially if T. Higgins is to get traded, which I think at this point won't happen. Yes, I think the offensive line could be slightly better, especially in the interior, but that's an experienced group of guys that have been there for quite some time. And yes, I do have some question marks about the running back room, but I actually am a big fan of Zach Moss and think he fits this offense quite nicely. So all in all, any position groups that this team may have some question marks over, I do think they have some really good players in those positions, and I do think that it will work out for them this upcoming season. But looking into this roster, we'll start off with Joe Burrow, who I think is easily a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. I've been recently seeing a lot of discourse surrounding Joe Burrow and where he stands amongst the rest of the NFL quarterbacks, and I think it's gotten a little bit ridiculous at this point. If you go on TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, wherever, honestly, you will see that Joe Burrow is being consistently snubbed from being in the top 5 conversation. And in some ways, I can definitely see why they do it. At the end of the day, Joe Burrow has just not been able to stay healthy through his young career. But in my opinion, one healthy Joe Burrow is easily a top 5 quarterback and arguably the second or third best quarterback when he's healthy. But that is a big caveat. He has got to stay healthy or else he's never going to be seriously mentioned in the likes of the Josh Allens and the Patrick Mahomes. But regardless of where we talk about him in terms of rankings to other quarterbacks, the Cincinnati Bengals have one of the best quarterbacks in the league in Joe Burrow. Through his young career, he's been nothing but spectacular, has led the Cincinnati Bengals team to a deep playoff run, has led them to a Super Bowl, hasn't gotten them the Super Bowl victory quite yet, but the Cincinnati Bengals team was just in their second year at that point, so gotta give credit to Joe Burrow. He's one of those special talents at the quarterback position. Paired alongside Joe Burrow is, of course, his running mate at LSU, Jamar Chase, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. I don't think he's quite up there with the likes of Justin Jefferson or Tyreek Hill, but I definitely do think he's in the conversation with guys like Devontae Adams and CeeDee Lamb, which is probably about top 10 to top 5 level guys. But if you have a guy who's being mentioned with those guys, you have one of those dudes in the NFL, and Jamar Chase is one of those dudes. Jamar Chase, through his young career, has been nothing but spectacular. Similar to Joe Burrow, has had a couple injuries here and there, but for the most part has been able to stay healthy and has been able to be productive for every season of his career. I fully do expect that at some point Jamar Chase will enter the Offensive Player of the Year conversations. Maybe it could be even this year. I do think he has that much level of talent, and I also think he has the production to stand by it. Alongside him is T. Higgins, who is also going to be looking for a contract. Will he get that contract this offseason or next offseason? I'm not too sure, but I do think regardless of that, he will be in a Cincinnati Bengals uniform for the long run. And I personally view T. Higgins as one of those guys who fits quite nicely alongside Jamar Chase. He's arguably, and in my opinion, he is the best wide receiver 2 in the NFL. Is he worth anything more than what I would be paying for a top tier wide receiver 1? No, he's somebody who should stick to being a wide receiver 2 because I don't think he'd be quite as successful as a wide receiver 1 in the NFL. And that's not a slight on him, it's just that Jamar Chase takes up so much coverage away from T. Higgins that it allows T. Higgins to be even more productive on his side of the field. And I do think looking at him next year, he should be in for a massive season as he's looking for that long-term contract, which he may get before the season or may get after the season. To fill out the rest of the offense, Jermaine Burton will likely be the receiver 3, a young rookie who has a bunch of potential, arguably would have been drafted earlier had he not had some off-the-field issues, but of course he is a rookie, so I'm a little bit low on the expectations for him, but when you have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, you can afford to take a flyer with your wide receiver 3. The rest of the offense doesn't have to be talked about in too much detail. You have Mike Gesicki at tight end, who's been a consistent tight end product for the past couple years. Your offensive line is pretty solid. The left tackle and right tackle combination of Orlando Brown Jr. and Trent Brown Brown and someday will be Amarius Mims is a really good combination of offensive tackles. I mentioned earlier that the interior of the offensive line isn't anything special, which I don't think it is special, but I do think it's really solid. Cordell Volson, Cody Ford, Ted Karras, Trey Hill, Alex Kappa, Jackson Kirkland, any of those guys can step in and be starting interior offensive linemen for this team, and I do think that they are all really good and solid players. Moving on to the defense, of course, Sam Hubbard, Trey Hendrickson, Sheldon Rankins, BJ Hill, and hopefully Miles Murphy are all really good pass rushers as well as really solid run stuffers. It's a really solid defensive line, and I think the key point for this defense is going to be within their secondary. Cam Taylor-Britt and Mike Holton, DJ Turner, and maybe Dax Hill have been some pretty productive players throughout their career, and I do think Dax Hill moving from safety to cornerback will allow him to hopefully flourish in that cornerback 2/3 role. I do think depth-wise is actually pretty solid here. I really like Cam Taylor-Britt and Mike Hilton, and of course DJ Turner is coming along in his career as well. They brought in Geno Stone, which I thought was a really good addition for a really good price from the Baltimore Ravens just last year. He should be a very productive player who can help this team force some turnovers. And then, of course, Von Bell. Don't have to talk about him too much. He's been in the league for quite some time, has been a staple of many different defenses. He's a really good player. So all in all, the roster in general is a really solid unit. There is not any gigantic holes for this team. And I think the biggest reason why is because this team has been building this roster for the past couple years. This is a team that has great chemistry because they've been together for quite some time. They're an experienced group that has been through a lot together. Of course, you do have some guys who haven't quite gotten to those levels yet. Guys like Jermaine Burton, Zach Moss, those guys haven't gotten quite to the level of like a Super Bowl, but the key foundational players of this team have gotten to that point, have gotten the experience, have went through failures and good points in their careers, and now they're heading into 2024 with all this expectations, and I do think that this is a type of team that could survive those expectations and be totally fine. But all right, we talked about some of the positive things going for the Cincinnati Bengals and why I personally believe they're going to be really freaking awesome next year. But now let's talk about the opposite side of things. Some little concerning things that I do have with this team. I don't really have a ton of concerns for this roster because it's one of the better units in the NFL. But of course, we have to talk about a couple of them. Let's hop into it. Briefly, I did want to recover some of the issues I have with the roster in general. Again, I don't think the running back position is quite up to standard of a lot of other teams. Like, this team doesn't have a Christian McCaffrey or a Alvin Kamara or one of those top tier running backs. They have Zach Moss, Chase Brown, Travion Williams, and maybe Chris Evans could get some run here and there. But all in all, again, as I said earlier, I think it's totally fine. I'm a big fan of Zach Moss, and I think he's going to have a really fun year for this team. I do think an upgrade for the tight end position is going to be due in the next couple seasons, whether that is Drew Sample or Tanner Hudson or somebody in a future draft. I don't think Mike Gesicki's a long-term answer at that position. But for me, that's really the only roster issues that I may have with this team. Again, there's really no big drastic change that needs to happen for this roster. It's a really solid roster all around. My biggest concern for this team is going to be the health of some key contributors, guys like Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, Trey Hendrickson, Logan Wilson, and some of these secondary members. I feel like if this team has a major injury in one of those major positions, it's really going to tank their season, especially if it is Joe Burrow. Obviously, Jake Browning is one of those really solid backup quarterbacks. He proved himself last year to be good enough to get this team some wins. But I do think if Joe Burrow is to miss a large part of the season, let's say he misses for some reason 7 games next year, that then could take this team from being championship favorites to barely making it into the playoffs and having to go up against an uphill battle come playoff time. So for this team, I do think it's very important that Joe Burrow plays at least like 13 or 14 games this year, which I think he will be able to do so. He's going through one of his first kind of healthy off seasons. I know he's still kind of coming back from injury, but by the time we get to training camp and all those big things happening, Joe Burrow should be healthy for him, and if that's the case, then it's going to be a nice big year for him next year. But again, injuries are going to be a concern for every single team. I just personally view this Bengals team as being that one specific team that just cannot afford a major injury to a major position. Of course, any team can't survive their quarterback going down for big moments in big parts of the season, but I think the Cincinnati Bengals really need Joe Burrow because I feel like if this team can get their groove going, let's say by the end of the season, that they can drive that into the playoffs and have a really deep playoff run, and who knows, maybe they could make the Super Bowl. But more of a bigger picture thing outside of some of the roster issues and some of the potential injury risk this team does have is of course going to be the rest of the competition in the AFC. The AFC in general is just such a brutal conference from start to finish, and especially within the Bengals' own division of the AFC North. It is one of the best conferences I've personally seen in my time of being an NFL fan. We'll start off with the AFC North. You have the Ravens, the Bengals, the Browns, and the Steelers. All 4 of those those teams, if they reach their highest potential ceiling, are all championship contenders. If the Pittsburgh Steelers get prime Russell Wilson, then that might be one of the best teams in the NFL. If the Browns get prime Deshaun Watson, that could also be one of the best teams in the NFL. The Ravens, really regardless of what they get from Lamar Jackson, as long as he's himself, they're going to be a contender this year. So just in one conference, you have 4 teams that could potentially all be contenders. In the AFC East, you have the likes of the Bills, the Dolphins, and the Jets, who I personally view as being 3 somewhat legitimate contenders. Not really the Dolphins, but the Bills and the Jets could easily get there. Then you have the AFC South, which may not have any championship contenders quite yet, but I do personally view the Texans and Colts as potential players who could be in that conversation at some point this season. And then, of course, within the AFC West, you have the Kansas City Chiefs, who are at this point a dynasty within the NFL, and if they can just continue to grow off of what they've been doing the past couple of years, that's going to be a team that should be favored every single season to win a championship. So my big concern for the Cincinnati Bengals is you're going into a season where all the expectations and all the opinions of this team is going to be based on how they do in the playoffs. If this team can get to the championship game, then obviously this team is going to continue to build on what they've been able to do. But I think the big questions come, what if they don't win a playoff game? Or what if they only win 2 playoff games and they're early exits out of the playoffs because of how good the rest of the AFC is? How much longer can this Bengals team consistently run back the same roster with some minor tweaks here or there and expect to continue to get better every single season, especially if injuries take a factor into the success of this Bengals season? If there are injuries, or if for some reason this team just doesn't reach the expectations we think they can hit, then that could definitely change the outlook for this Bengals team moving forward. I do personally view this season as somewhat of a must-win type of season for the Bengals. I'm not saying they have to win a championship this year, but I think they at least have to make the AFC Championship game, because in my opinion, if your team does not get that far with all the experienced guys that they have, it's going to be really hard to sell the fans on bringing back this exact same roster with, again, some minor tweaks and expect there to be any different outcome from what has happened the past couple years. I know Cincinnati has been able to make a deep playoff run, has been able to beat the Chiefs, has been able to beat the Buffalo Bills, but if they can't do it this year, it's going to be a hard sell for your NFL fans. And that's not really a knock on the Bengals. I think overall, they should run back this same roster for the next couple years and keep trying to take a whack at this thing. But the rest of the AFC is just super dominant right now that I do have some question marks whether or not the Bengals can get to that point. Because I look at a team like Baltimore and I personally do believe they're just as good, if not better, than the Cincinnati Bengals. Same thing with the Chiefs, maybe the same thing with the Texans and Jets, and hell, maybe even the Colts. So that there is just 5 teams off the top of my head that could potentially be on the same level of the Cincinnati Bengals and are all going to be trying to make deep playoff runs. So I do personally view the Cincinnati Bengals as one of those teams that could definitely win it all, but let's say they don't win it all. What's going to happen with this team? I think there's a lot of question marks that could come from that. But alright, we talked about some of the good, talked about some of the question marks for this team. Let's now give you guys my unofficial synopsis. And yes, my unofficial synopsis, because later in the offseason, I'll give out my big overall prediction for every single team. We'll have that video coming out probably next month. But in my personal opinion, I do think the Cincinnati Bengals team is one of the best teams in the NFL. If they can stay healthy, and if Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and those guys can play up to the level that we know they can hit, we're talking about a team that could easily win over 12 games next year. They don't really have the easiest schedule in the NFL. Of course, they're playing in the hardest division in the league. They're playing in a super tough conference. But every team, in my opinion, has a pretty tough schedule this year. It's a really loaded NFL. But I do personally view the Cincinnati Bengals as one of those teams that can be competitive with any team out there, can win a lot of games, and can make a deep playoff run to maybe winning a Super Bowl. So again, I think they'll win over 12 games next year if they stay healthy, and I do think they'll be able to make that deep playoff run if things go their way. But Bengals fans, let me know in the comment section below, do you guys agree or disagree with this video? Do you guys agree and disagree with any of the points I made? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.